Well, hey there. Thanks for joining the Ridge Community Church online. It's good to be here with you today, wherever you're joining us. And if you're new, I want to extend a special welcome to you. Our vision as a church is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home because Jesus offers hope like no one else. And our goal for our time together today is just simply to inspire you to take your next step on your faith journey because we believe we are all on a faith journey. My name is Tyler, and I serve as our online campus pastor, and I'm excited to be your host for our service together today. And we want to hear from you throughout service today. So if you're joining us live on YouTube or on live.theridgecc.com, go ahead and say hi in the chat. Let us know where you are joining us from. If you're watching later on YouTube, just go ahead and say hi in the comments. We monitor the comments all throughout the week, so we would love to respond to you and hear from you throughout the week. In fact, here's a question you can begin to answer in the chat right now, and that is, when you were younger, what was one hot topic that your family discouraged you from talking about with others? And you can go ahead and throw whatever that might be. For me, when I grew up in a family like many of yours, where my family tried to avoid conflict. And so there were some things they told us not to talk about, like don't ask others who did you vote for, don't ask others, how much money do you make, and don't ask your cousin, why is that person bringing a new guy to every holiday gathering? It's like a new person, like every single year. I mean, don't talk about it. But we know that there are a lot of hot topics in our life, and there's even hotter ones that we generally want to avoid to talk about. But what happens is if we don't wrestle with them, if we don't talk about them, it ends up stalling us on our faith journey. And that's why we want to talk about it. In fact, today our lead pastor, Mark, is going to kick off a brand new series called Hot Topics. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these topics that many of you have said you want the church to talk about. And we think the church should be one of the safest places to talk about this and wrestle with it so that we can take our next step on our faith journey. In fact, today, we're going to kick it off by looking at one of the hottest topics that you told us you want us to talk about. And many of you are wrestling with this. In fact, I've worked with students over the last 10 years, and I know many high school students have wrestled with this. And this is, what do we do with God and science? Can you believe in both? How are they compatible? Well, we're going to talk about that. And if you know someone who wrestles with that question, take today's link and send it to them and just share it with them and say, hey, would you join me for service today and watch this with me? So we're going to head over to our lead pastor, Mark, in just a moment. But before we do that, we are going to actually head over to our band. And our band's going to lead us in a time of music. And in this time of music, I want to encourage you to not just send today's link, but pay attention to the lyrics, as we will discover a way that the lyrics will help us connect with God in a brand new way. So let's go ahead and let's head over to our band. Thanks for joining us for the Ridge Online.
God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time. With no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of light. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. God of your promise, you don't speak in vain, no syllable empty or void. For once you have spoken, nature and science follow the sound of your voice. And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said. Creation still obeys you, so will I. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. If the mountains bow in reverence, this, so will I. For if everything exists to lift you high, so will I. If the wind goes where you send it, so will I. If the rocks cry out in silence, so will I. Oh, if the song of all our praises still falls short, then we'll sing again 100 billion times. God of salvation, you chased down my heart through all of my failure and pride. On a hill you created, the light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. And as you speak, 100 billion failures disappear. We lost your life so I could find it here. Yeah. You left the grave behind you, so will I. I could see your heart and everything you've done. Every part designed in a work of art, all is blood. You gladly chose surrender, so will I. Like you would again 100 billion times. But one measure could amount to your desire. You're the one who never leaves the one behind.
All right. Hey, want to welcome everybody here, and I want to say a special welcome to all you who are joining us online, wherever you're joining us from. Hey, great to be with you, as today we are starting a brand new series we are calling Hot Topics. And I'm really excited about this series because we've never done anything like this before. So what we've done is we sent out a survey to some websites like Reddit and some other sites, and we asked this question: what would you like the church to talk about? And what we wanted to know is, what are people who wouldn't consider themselves religious people or church people, what are they wanting to talk about? And so what we did is we've collected the survey results, and then we decided that we are going to talk about some of the most popular results that we got. And so over the next 5 weeks, I didn't determine what the results were. Other people determined what the results were. And so honestly, I'm just really excited about that. Plus, the way that we approach this was just very, very important to me, because I believe that the local church should be the safest place to explore, to doubt, to wrestle and wonder about things, and most importantly, to have conversations about these things. That if there are things that people are wrestling and wondering about, I mean, they're going to wrestle and wonder about it somewhere. Why not do it here? And so this is what this series is all about. Now, if you would consider yourself a Christian, however you're engaging with us, hey, we're so glad that you're here, and we hope you journey with us, because we believe every single person is on a faith journey, and conversations like we're going to have over the next couple of weeks are a big part of that journey. Now, if you are a Christian, I'm really glad you're journeying with us as well, and I hope that you will allow yourself to wrestle and wonder as well, and maybe even get uncomfortable at times. I've been following Jesus for over 20 years now. I know I look, only 25, but I've been following Jesus for 20 years now. And there are things, honestly, that I still wrestle and wonder about. And you know what? My guess would be you do too. And so what I want you to do is I want to give you permission to not have all the answers, because let's be honest, none of us has all the answers. And so I want you to join in this conversation as well. Plus, here's what I've noticed. When there are things that we wrestle and wonder about, if we are willing to lean into those things, that doesn't hurt your faith. It's actually an opportunity to deepen your faith. Now, today, as we kick things off, we're going to kick things off with one of the hottest topics, the topic of God and science. And at the heart of this, I think lies two questions. And the questions are, aren't Christianity and science incompatible? And don't they contradict each other? And so the thought is kind of this. The thought is there are two groups of people. And on the one group, there is the science people. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to about God and faith. And when the conversation is done, their response is, well, I believe in science. And implied is that, in that is that I'm a person who believes in reason and facts and rationale. Now, the other group is what is considered faith people. And faith people are people who believe in God, and because they believe in God, there's this assumption that they don't believe in facts and rationale and reason, and even to the point where some would say that they use God as a crutch. And so here's what you have. You have fact-based science people versus faith-based religious people, and because we're told that you have to choose, it's a contradiction to believe in both. Now, because this is such a big topic and I only have the opportunity to do one talk, my goal for today is to not lay out evidence for the existence of God, even though I feel like that's a really important thing. In fact, if you're interested in that, we have resources for you to dig in to do that, so I want to encourage you to do just that. My goal for today is to talk about this idea that it's either Christianity or science. That this whole idea that you have to choose either Christianity or science is honestly one big fat myth. That it is reasonable for you to believe in both God and science. I love what author David Berlinski, who's wrote a ton of stuff on the history of science, I love what he said. When he wrote this, he wrote, "Science without religion, it's lame. But religion without science is blind." And I think that sums it up so well. Now, Jesus himself even encourages this. Jesus one time said this. He said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul," and what else? "With all your mind." You see, faith isn't wishful thinking. According to Jesus, true faith engages the whole person, which includes our mind. Which means faith should engage things like reason and logic and the way the world works, and that includes science. So what I want to do is I want to begin by giving you a brief history of where this whole myth began. And the reason that I want to do this is because this whole idea that there's been, two groups of people, science people and faith people, it hasn't always existed. It really didn't start to take root until this period right here known as the Enlightenment, where God and science people began to be seen as opposing forces with each other. Now, the Enlightenment period was this era where there was all sorts of scientific discovery. And as the scientific discoveries began to just happen and become more rapid, some people began to think that we're going to reach a time where science is going to explain everything. Well, as a result of this, there was a group of Christians who began to feel very threatened by this whole idea. So much so that they began to get defensive when it came to the whole idea of science and the discoveries of science. Now, what did this cause? This caused a gap between science and Christianity. Now, this gap has only gotten larger over time due to this system of thought that became very popular during the Enlightenment period, and it's still very, very popular today. It affects us more than you realize, and when you understand what it is, you understand how much it affects us. This whole system of thought called secularism. Now, here's how I define secularism. I define secularism this way. It's just the belief that the happiest life, because everybody's looking to live the happiest life, right? The belief that the happiest life is found through science, technology, and education. Now, some people would add politics to this nowadays, but it's really these three things. Now, notice what's missing in that definition. You see, because secularism, it teaches that religious beliefs of all kind have been disproven by the recent developments of science and technology. And so as a result, they should be discarded altogether. Richard Dawkins, he's one of the most well-known atheists, he said it this way. He said, faith is like a mental illness. Thanks a lot, Richard. We're just telling me I have a mental illness. I mean, I know I've got issues, but thanks a lot. Faith is like a mental illness, a great cop-out, the excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. And so you see in his quote, there's the dichotomy. There are science people, and science people are all just about reason and logic and evidence. And then you have faith people, and faith people are all about avoiding the evidence. What's interesting is that in the last 20 years, we are seeing a real pushback against this whole idea of secularism. That we are seeing a pushback against this myth that people who believe in God don't believe in science. Now, what has happened over the last 20 years? As people have delved deeper into just the way the universe works, it's actually having a reverse effect on secularism. That as people dive more into things like science and philosophy and psychology, they're discovering that there's actually an increased evidence for reasons to believe in the existence of God. British theologian Leslie Newbigin, Leslie puts it this way. He says, way back in the day, he's talking about in the Enlightenment period, we all thought that as technology and science got deeper, as cosmology went deeper, as biology went deeper than ever, that faith would be abandoned. No one would have faith by the end of the 20th century. And so that's that idea of, there was that fear of, we keep going down the trail of science, and eventually it's just going to disprove everything about faith. But then he talks about what's actually happened. And what we've seen is robust Orthodox faith is flourishing all over the world. You see, what he's talking about is that people have discovered that secularism is actually a myth, that people are realizing that they're actually spiritual, that people like Adam Sandler and Jim Carrey and Oprah and Miley Cyrus, just to name a few, they do things like meditate. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I didn't realize that Ace Ventura and the Water Boy were spiritual. But yes, they are. You only get that at the Ridge Community Church. And what else is happening is that we are seeing more and more very smart people that are believing in both God and science. Dr. Francis Collins was at one time agnostic. He now is the director of the National Institute of Health, and he also at one time was the international leader of the Genome Project. In other words, no one knows more about DNA than Dr. Francis Collins. Well, as he shares his story, he talks about how it was his work with DNA that led to his faith in Christ, where eventually he wrote this really, really fascinating book and worth the read. And the book is called this, The Language of God. And then notice the subtitle, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Not Unbelief, but for belief. Another myth that has fueled this myth that, you can't believe in both Christianity and science. Another myth is this whole idea that the church has always been anti-science. Many of us can remember the middle school days. Some of us will call those the glory days. And we can remember science class in middle school. And what did we learn about in science class? We learned about this whole era called the scientific revolution. And it was during learning about the scientific revolution that we learned about some of the most famous scientists that have ever lived, that are still influencing our lives today. And here are a few of them. Newton, who defined the laws of motion, including gravity. Pascal, who many people give credit as kind of the brains behind the eventual invention of the computer. And then Kepler, who defined the laws of planetary motions and eyeglasses, which I'm probably going to need in a few months. So I really appreciate him. Now, here's what's interesting, and here's what you didn't know about these three scientists. All three of them were fully devoted followers of Jesus. And here's how you can know. You can actually look them up, and you can read their journals, and you will see page after page after page of them writing prayers to Jesus and having Bible verses throughout those prayers. Rodney Stark is a sociologist, and he combed through a bunch of journals, and he combed through a bunch of personal artifacts of 52 of the most influential scientists in the scientific revolution. And here's what he discovered. 98% of them were committed Christians. You see, they studied creation because they believed in studying creation that they learned about the God who made everything. And here's the thing, that's just a few examples. I am not even scratching the surface on these because there's so much more. And while there's been a group of people throughout history from the church that have resisted science and the discoveries of science, for the most part, Christianity has encouraged scientific exploration, not discouraged it. So here's what I want to do with the few minutes I have left. I want to give you 3 insights that will, I hope, help you understand that you really can believe in both God and science. Now, I believe there's a lot more than 3, okay? But I'm just going to give you 3. Here's the first one. First one is this. As you look at this topic, it is really important to understand what both science and faith, what they're trying to accomplish. Now, this is often confusing, which drives a lot of the confusion. So let's look at what they're trying to accomplish. Let's look at science first. Science is all about the how of things. In fact, here's the very definition of science. Science is the systematic knowledge of the physical or material world gained through observation and experimentation. Now, in the definition itself, you will see that a method is introduced. And once again, going back to middle school science, we were introduced to the scientific method. And here's the scientific method. And this was actually created by Francis Bacon, another committed Christian. And so here's the scientific method. It starts out raising a question. And some of you are like, oh man, these are bad memories from middle school and high school science. I know, I'm taking you there. Got to go there, all right? You know, start out with a question, and then we had to go through this process, and then the process ended up with a conclusion. And what is the conclusion? The conclusion is, this is how whatever that is works, or this is how whatever that is came to be. And thankfully, there are countless hows that science has discovered, which has provided tremendous benefit in our world. Now, that's science. Faith, on the other hand, is all about the why, which is something that science can't discover because science is not set up to discover that. And so faith seeks answers to questions like the divine and the afterlife and purpose and just the universal moral law idea. Let me give you an example of how both science and God, or science and Christianity, can work together. Now, I believe this is how it's meant to work together, but let me just give you an example. And I'm going to give you an example by looking at the very first verse in the entire Bible. And this is a verse that has caused so much unnecessary debate between faith and science people. So here's the very first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, we lock into these 2 words here because these are the 2 words that have caused all the debate. So science seeks to discover how, in this case, God created. Now, the Bible never talks about how, and the Bible is not concerned with how. The Bible is just concerned with that God did. And the rest of the Bible is the story of why he did. Now, understanding these two different purposes goes a long way in closing the gap between the two. So now when someone says to me, well, I believe in science, you know what my response is every time? I do too. You see, science and learning about science, I actually love to read about science and the learning about science. It doesn't hurt my faith, it helps my faith, because every time I read something, I'm like, oh, that's how God did it. Wow, is that awesome? Plus, here's what many of us don't think about. Most people, if they're honest, they have blurred these two together. Let me give you an example. Let's just say you're a faith person, and you or someone you love is very, very sick. What do? Well, you pray for God to heal that person. But what else do? Well, you probably take that person to a hospital so they can be around nurses and doctors, and medicine, which science helped create, shows faith that you trust him to do that. Now, let's just say you're a science person, and it's a similar scenario, but let's just say it's you that is very sick, maybe even terminal. And I've seen stories like this. And so you get to this point where you realize that now nothing can help you. It is outside of science. At that point, here's what most people do. They try to reach out to something beyond themselves. And you know what they don't reach out to? Science. They reach out to something beyond science and beyond themselves. Maybe even God. So every single one of us, if we're honest, we have blurred these two ideas to some degree. So that's the first one. All right, you ready for the second one? I know, you're like, Mark, this is, you're smarter than you look. Thank you, I know that. All right, here's the second one. Here's the second one. Everyone has faith. Everyone has faith. Even the most committed atheist has faith. You see, every single one of us comes to life with a certain perspective, with a certain agenda. Now, we don't come to things with a blank slate. We like to think that we do, but none of us does, because every single one of us has a worldview. And so as a result, when we talk about a topic like this, there are certain things, whether you're a science person or a God person, that we hold on to very tightly. So as you're gauging the information, it's seen through a filter of a certain agenda. Let me give you an example of this. Harvard biologist, the guy that I name Richard Lewontin, he wrote some articles in this publication. He and the scientists that he works with prefer naturalistic and atheistic explanations to the things that they study, which is not really a surprise. It's actually more common than you realize. But it's what he wrote next that is a surprise. He actually talks about and admits why they do. And here's what he said. He said, it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are, and listen to this, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes. In other words, we already step into this with a filter. And the filter is never leads to God. It never leads to God. And he even says this, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, what he admits is amazing, and it's more common, once again, than you realize. You see, what he admits is this, is that his science isn't determined by facts. It's determined by philosophy. You see, his faith position determines his science, not the other way around. And his faith position is this, everything we will find has a non-theistic explanation to it. You see, every single one of us, whether you're a faith person or a science person, every single one of us has faith at some level, because there are things that we all believe in that we can't prove with 100% accuracy. Let me give you another example of this. I was recently reading this story about this nurse who was a Christian. And she worked in this hospital with a bunch of other nurses and doctors, and none of them were Christians. And they were dealing with this patient. And this patient happened to be in really serious condition, and he was on life support, and they were trying to make the decision on whether to pull him off of life support or not. Well, the doctors had always told her when she came on staff, they said, we know that you're a faith person, but never let your faith commitment influence how you do your job as a nurse. And so they have this really serious case, and they finally decide that the best thing for this gentleman is to pull him off life support, and that's exactly what they did. And so they pull him off life support, and they all gather outside the room, the nurses and the doctors, and they're talking. And one of the doctors says, well, I'm glad that we did that, because now he's not suffering anymore. And they all just kind of nodded their head, and they walked out. But the nurse, who was a Christian, sat there and she wondered, how do they know that? And the reality is, they don't know that. See, they just made a faith comment. So as you look at faith and science, this is not about, one group has faith and the other group doesn't have faith. Everyone has faith to some degree. Third and final insight is this. Science has realized it can't disprove the existence of God. It can't disprove the existence of God. Why? Because the very definition of science we looked at earlier talked about the material or physical world. But as we talked about the existence of God, it is something that's called a metaphysical question. And when you look at the word metaphysical, it just means this. It means beyond or after existence. That God is actually a being that is beyond the physical or material world. Thus, the existence of God is not something that physics can actually evaluate properly. Another Harvard guy, a Harvard professor by the name of Stephen Jay Gould, he is known as one of the most well-known evolutionary biologists, historians of science, and he's an atheist. He understood this whole idea that science, it can't disprove the existence of God. And he wrote about this time and time again. And one time he said this. He said, to say it for my colleagues and for the umpteenth million time, science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, educate the issues of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm nor deny it. We simply cannot comment on it as scientists. And so what is he admitting? He is admitting that physics cannot disprove cannot prove that a metaphysical being doesn't exist. But you know what it can do? It can help us provide evidence that he does exist, which pushes against this whole idea that science and physics are enemies of faith. You see, what if science can actually point to God rather than point you away from God? What if science can actually point you to God, not disprove him? You see, here's what you need to know about all this. This isn't a war of fact-based science people versus faith-based religious people. You see, throughout history, when people had questions about the stars or the sky or, rocks or trees or the weather, you know what the answer was? The answer was, there's gods in there. But then Christianity comes along and says, look at what God has made. Because what God has made is so complex and it's so organized and it's worth looking into. So Christianity doesn't run from science and reason. Rather, it moves into it by asking this important question. What is actually true about the world and implied that God has made? Which leads me to this passage that I want to read that was written by the Apostle Paul in the first century, and it's found in the book of Romans. And here's what Paul wrote. He said this, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, they've been clearly seen. Well, how have they been seen, Paul? Being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. In other words, science is one way. The invisible God reveals himself to us. And then Jesus comes along And he says, let me make the invisible visible. Let me live within your context. Let me die the death that you were meant to die. And let me rise from the dead so you can have life. You know, if you have questions about this topic still, I want to encourage you to just continue to dig into this and to continue to ask questions and to continue to lean into this. And we have resources that will help you in this discussion. And like I said, it's just worth digging into. And I think having the conversation is a part of you being on the journey that you're on right now. But let me just say this. My prayer and hope for you and for us is that we'd be willing to doubt our doubts enough, be skeptical about our skepticism enough that we would be willing to lean in. And if you find yourself disrupted because you lean in, listen, that's okay. Because it's only when we lean in that we truly grow. Let me pray for us. And Father, I thank you that this whole topic of science and you, that it's not something that we have to just resist or pull back from, get defensive about. It's something that we can lean into. And Father, it's something that not only can we lean into, but when we lean into it, eventually as we kind of comb through all the stuff, we're going to see you behind every single thing. Father, thank you that the local church is meant to be a place where we can wrestle and we can have doubts and we can question things. That's not a bad thing, God. That is actually a really, really good thing. And so I pray over the next few weeks that we would be willing to do that together. And God, that we would encourage that we would have conversations about that, and most of all, God, that you would open up our hearts to that. So thank you for this topic. Thank you, God, that as we look at topics like this, we discover that you are there and that we are meant to see you in the midst of all this. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
We'd love to hear from you. What was your biggest takeaway from that message? What questions do you still have? Go ahead and leave those in the comments or in the chat, and we'd love to respond to you throughout this week. But earlier, I mentioned that our vision as a church is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. And I want you to notice that word bring. It's an active word. And what that means is that if you're a follower of Jesus, you're invited by God to partner with him to actually take the hope that has been shared with you and to share that with others. Not because we want to turn people into projects, but because we believe that Jesus offers hope like nothing else, that the hope of Jesus really does make life better. And so what that means is that if you're a follower of Jesus, we want to develop relationships and build trust with our neighbors, with our coworkers, with our friends, and those who may not be yet close to God, to hopefully show them one day that the hope of Jesus really does make life better. And we often refer to them as your ones. And what we do as followers of Jesus is we just look for opportunities to be good news to them and to build trust and build these relationships. And one opportunity is coming up in just a few weeks as we look at the calendar, and that is trick-or-treating. Because trick-or-treating, trick-or-treating, it allows the opportunities for our neighbors to go outside, to go in the neighborhood, and to actually go and be out with their kids and their friends. And we know that our neighborhood comes alive. And as a church, we want to help equip each other to treat our street, to turn up the dial a little bit, to help build even more trust and more relationships with our neighbors. In fact, last year, my wife and I took advantage of this, where we actually heard from the Ridge some different ideas of how we could treat our street. And we actually decided to bring our grill out into our driveway and grill up a bunch of brats to give away to the adults as the kids also came along and trick-or-treated. And back then, it was social distance because of COVID and all of that. But we were able to actually connect with the grown-ups that were going trick-or-treating with the kids. And they were just surprised about the brats. They're like, oh, hey, thanks so much for doing that for us. And what happened is it allowed us to actually have some conversations with some adults that we haven't had conversations with before. In fact, we had one neighbor across the street who experienced a big tragedy the year before. And this neighbor hasn't really opened up or talked about it, but because of the brats, this neighbor did come over, and he and I were able to have a conversation and begin to build a relationship over that and over a cold drink during trick-or-treating time. And so that's what we want for you, is to have this opportunity to build some relationships with your neighbors in your neighborhood with trick-or-treating coming up. And so we want to invite you to get some ideas to treat your street. And the way that you can do that is by visiting the website that you're going to see below me or downloading our app and tapping on the Your One section to get ideas on how you can treat your street and build trust and build relationships with your neighbors in the next couple of weeks. So I hope you go ahead and you do that. Now, another way that we partner with God to bring the hope of Jesus to others is by giving generously back to God. And the reason why is every dollar that we give actually goes towards that vision to share that hope with others. So right now, we're going to move into the part of our service where we bring our offerings back to God. If you're new with us or if you don't call yourself a Christian, you can actually let this part of service just pass you by. But if you are a Christian, I want to invite you to take this step of faith to give digitally back to God by visiting the website that you see below me or tapping the Give tab on our app. We're going to take a moment. We're going to do this together. And then after this moment, I'm going to be back to wrap us up. Hey, thank you so much for doing that with us. And today was just the kickoff to Hot Topics. I mean, we have several weeks of Hot Topics to talk about. So make sure you join us next week. You can do that by hitting that subscribe button on YouTube and make sure that you're reminded so that way you're notified when we are live. Or you can join us in person here at our Greenfield campus. Or you can host a watch party and just invite some friends or family members or your neighbors or your ones to join you and watch this together. But we want to encourage you to do that. But don't join us alone. Bring someone with you, have them check it out, watch online with somebody, and join together as we continue Hot Topics. And as you invite someone, as you share today's link, would you do so in a way that you remind yourself, hey, you're bringing the hope of Jesus into every home. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great week.